So today we're talking to Gary L. Lemons is it's got the L in the book titles. Gary, I'm so excited to have this conversation. I'm going to tell it, you already know this, but I'm going to tell it to the audience that's watching. I was your student. I'm guessing it was 1997 or 1998. That's my guess. I was trying to figure it out in my head earlier today. And not only do I think you were my first college professor ever, and therefore the first person who really gave me any kind of serious writing instruction, you were also my first real introduction to feminism, and certainly my first introduction to Bell Hooks, who I quote in my book a lot, and you quote a lot in all of your work. And it had a huge impact on me. Always in the back of my head. You and I have not spoken since then, other than a few emails to arrange this call. And I recently read your book, which I'm kind of sad that I didn't read earlier while I was writing my book, because there was so much in it where I was like, well, that would have shifted a little bit of how I might have framed things. But what I realized while reading it was just you had an even bigger influence on me than I realized. And that it really struck me a couple things, like my writing style to this day is still a very autobiographical, starting with really, an autobiographical thinking and moving into larger cultural issues, larger psychological issues, larger social justice issues. Even as a college professor, I realized while reading this how much of my teaching style mimics that. And I want to give you credit for it. It might also just be that you're the first, so it's always like that formative experience. But one thing I'll tell you is I actually read, and probably because of your class, before every semester, before I start teaching, I at least read a chapter or two from one of Bell Hooks's books on education, just like, calisthenics, like get myself back in the right mindset to make sure I'm ready to walk into the class. And I guess there's one thing I read, which actually is in a more recent thing you wrote there. You said, my aim has been to employ the college classroom as a strategic site to practice pedagogy rooted in student transformation and self-liberation. And I read that and I went, I've never said it that way, but that's exactly how I think about it. So I'm just really excited to talk to you because you had such an influence in my life. So welcome. I know it was a really long introduction, but welcome.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start here, which is I read your part in Black Male Outsider where you said that almost all the white male students drop your course. And at first I was like super proud of myself. I was like, I didn't drop that course. I'm one of the good ones. But then as I read through the whole rest and all week this week while I've been thinking about this conversation, I thought, I didn't drop your course because that was some white male privilege. Like I was like, what do I have to be scared of? Like, what am I afraid of? I guess what can you say about that experience of so many white male students dropping your course?
And what is the course, just for those of us who don't know?
Well, the course. Well, I'll let you describe it.
Well, over the course of now more than 2 decades teaching in PWIs, and if you don't know what PWI stands for, predominantly white institutions, from New York City, as you were a student of mine at the New School, Eugene Lang College, and then moving to the South. And some people don't think of Florida as the South, but it is. Because not far from where I live, if you go down this particular highway, you will see a Confederate flag. It's huge. Mm-hmm. And it's always flying. And it's intimidating from the standpoint of what this actually represents in this particular state. So, this is a conservative state. It's Republican based, and the governor of Florida is Republican. And there have been already implementations to extract certain voting implications for especially for BIPOC individuals, and one would say across economic status as well. But in relationship to your question about the way that I teach, a particular course that I taught here at the University of South Florida, maybe about, I would say maybe 5 years ago, is a course that African American literature course focused on the writings of Langston Hughes, a collection of short stories called The Ways of White Folks. And I'll never forget when I met the students in the course for the first time. There were maybe 4 or 5 white male students who had registered for the course. This would be considered, quote unquote, a course in the English department. And when I started to move through the syllabus in terms of the requirements, the Ways of White Folks collection of short stories by Langston Hughes was one of the books that the students had to read. Well, as I was moving through the syllabus, those white males packed their bags and left the class. And one of the things I have come to clearly understand is that, as Bell Hooks would say, race talk is full of complexities, but also intimidating, not only across race, but gender, sexual identity, one would say economic status, ability, and the list goes on and on. But in the context of the history of the way that institutionalized oppression and domination works or has worked in the context of the United States and the building of it, we continue to have to deal with the ways that Bell Hooks would say imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy intimidates individuals to the point to where the conversations may not move forward, especially in the context of an academic environment where there is this sense that there should not be problem solving around issues of race because we're integrated. And so why are we even talking about it? So I would just say, Jordan, that even in the context of your having been a student with me back at the New School, and how many years ago, as you were pointing out, that was, even to this very moment, I continue to teach African American literature from a Black feminist, womanist standpoint, so that the issue of whether a student across differences will be able to engage complicated, complex dialogues around the intersection of race and how that really configures in terms of one's status in a society that is founded historically on imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy is always going to be a challenge, not only for the students, but from the standpoint of a Black male pro-feminist, womanist professor who I am.
Yeah. So I want to start with, like, you brought up a few terms here that I want to define before I get any further. One, can you talk about the Alice Walker definition of womanist, right? And this idea, I think she says womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. So if you could define that, but also talk about this idea of feminist as opposed to pro-feminist.
Yes. Well, let me go back to Alice Walker's definition of a womanist, because I think this is really critically important, because in terms of my identification as a Black male, cisgendered identified professor, to say I am a pro-feminist, particularly in the context of Alice Walker's definition of a womanist, she defines a womanist as a Black feminist or feminist of color, first and foremost, that is universalist, committed to the liberation of all people across gender differences. And she says that a womanist loves the folks, loves roundness, loves to dance, loves love, loves the spirit. And she has spirit with a capital S, loves the spirit. And she ends the definition by saying, regardless. And so what I've done over the course of time is to manifest Alice Walker's definition within a visionary context where, even though she starts out by defining it as a Black feminist and or feminist of color, I actually work to envision it in a larger context. I just had a book to come out in 2019 called Building Womanist Coalitions, Writing and Teaching in the Spirit of Love, and it's published by the University of Illinois Press. Well, I have white folks in the book. And of course, Alice Walker's definition of a womanist really opens up the binary social construction of sexual identity to the extent that she says all sexual identities are included. So I make sure that when I pedagogically represent womanism and Black feminism to be a pro-feminist identified Black male cisgendered professor, I want everyone to feel the power of inclusion. And that's what I take away from Alice Walker's definition of a womanist. And then to compare this within an artistic framework where you just pointed out the color relationship of purple to lavender, shades of difference rather than binary difference. And I think that is her artistic expression of the way that we should really deconstruct and move to eradicate this binary social construction of identity, especially in connection with those of us who are coming to build alliances across differences for social justice.
Yeah. And you use the word pro-feminist in the subtitle of your book. What does pro-feminist mean as opposed to just feminist?
Well, I think when you look at the subtitle, you have to compare it to the main title, Black Male Outsider, a memoir teaching as a pro-feminist man. So, over the course of time, I've had individuals who identify as feminists across racial, ethnic differences to say, wait, how are you, in terms of economic statuses within the context of BIPOC identity, feminist is something that white people are into. And so that term, even feminist, isn't used in many BIPOC communities because it's associated, and it's a class standing term as well. So some BIPOC people would say, we don't even, when you say feminism, what is it that you're talking about? But then those who have heard the term feminist often associate it with white female, lesbian identified women. And so to be pro, that is to be for. And I have a book called Womanist Forefathers, Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois. And I actually, in the book, go back and revisit their histories of support for women's rights. And so this whole idea of being for the agency of liberation for the rights of all individuals who identify within a female or woman context is to say that men across our differences can be supportive of the rights of women to be free.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you one more definition, even though I know the answer to this one already, but I'm hoping that many of the people who are watching this are new to this conversation and that we've brought some in to a conversation they're not familiar with. But I think there's a lot of people who don't know what BIPOC means. So.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. Okay. And so, again, around inclusive terminology, this working to make sure that we have a sense of those who are pro, people who are allied for social justice for all the oppressed. Could we come up with a term that really represents that inclusion? So BIPOC actually represents Black, Indigenous, people of color. So yes, this is kind of a hip, new terminology that really has to be opened up and explained. But when we think about the interconnection of race and ethnicity, that this whole idea of African American / Black community interrelated with the indigenous representation of those individuals who were on this land before white folks came here to take this land and to exterminate, destroy those people who were already on this land. Even Africans had come to this land even before white Eurocentric folk came to this land. And then people of color, which suggests this moves across ethnic differences, especially in the context now. And I've been saying this, and I've said it to my students. I just finished teaching a graduate course on bell hooks called Bell Hooks and the Power of Autocryptography. And I'll talk about that as we move through this whole idea of what autocryptography is. And I just finished teaching an undergraduate course on African American literature. But one of the things that, I've actually continued to practice in my interrogation of the way that binary systemic oppression and domination actually works to separate individuals is to begin to envision communicative language that is about building bridges. As Cherry Moraga and Gloria Ann Saldua would say, this bridge called My Back, Radical Writings by Women of Color, is to come, and I didn't come up with the term BIPOC, but Jordan, as you said, could you explain exactly actually what that term means? Black, Indigenous, people of color is a signification of unity. Yeah. And this idea that even now in the context of the way that we're having to deal with the perpetuation of the violence of white supremacy, especially in the murder of African Americans, Black individuals in the system, especially now in relationship to Asian attacks of violence. And so there is now this moment where we really do, particularly as BIPOC communities, have to really come together to really understand our struggle against imperialist white supremacist patriarchy has to be aligned with diversity, with white allies in particular who are willing to stand out and talk and stand up for BIPOC communities. And that means, as Peggy McIntosh, who has written so much about white identity and the privilege of white identity in her one particular essay, and she and I go back for decades in terms of our connection with each other, in terms of our scholarship. But she has an article that she lists 26 white privileges. And I just finished teaching that in my undergraduate African American lit class, and where the students actually had to engage in dialogue about those privileges. And again, teaching in a PWI, in which I've never taught in an institution of higher learning where people of color were the majority. But to be in an African American literature course where the majority of the students are white, both at the undergraduate and graduate level, is to have those students begin to think critically from the inner reflection of what it means to be white to the way that gets acted out in ways that many white people have no idea that they even have these privileges until you begin to have somebody white say, look, let's kind of think about some things in terms of your identity as a white individual. And so it's about, as Bell Hooks would say, coming to this place of critical awareness for, as she, and I use this phrase she uses consistently, for self-actualization. As I would say, in underscoring continually, as you referenced earlier, her trilogy of pedagogy, where she has those 3 books where she really talks about, I think in a sum total, this whole idea that she takes away from Paulo Freire's idea of education as the practice of freedom.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating to hear you talk, given what's happened with Me Too and BLM last summer. And you have such a unique perspective being able to understand the multifaceted events and understand what's going on. Are you, change is hard, change is slow, change seems to never happen the way you want it to happen. But what's your, have you seen any fundamental shifts or any shifts at all in the last couple of years that you have been waiting for during your career that give you some sense of optimism?
To be honest, Amanda, hope is, in terms of implementation of social justice in this country, over the course of 400 years, we are yet still experiencing the hatred that is rooted in white supremacy.
Yeah.
And even with white people denying that the capital of this country was violated,
Mm-hmm.
and even white people wanting to kill white people in the Capitol who they believed were taking away their rights as American citizens. You say, well, where is the hope? That's the question you ask me. Well, I want to be very, very specific about my position in relationship to the possibility of hope that at some place in time, before maybe we all are not in this place on earth anymore in a physical way, think about change moving forward for social justice. And I'll be, as I said, very specific. In this last semester, in both of my undergraduate African American literature course and the course, my graduate course that I taught on bell hooks, all of the students remained in the course throughout the semester. Nobody dropped the course. And one of the things, and you both know that in this time of the pandemic, COVID-19, most universities, I think, I imagine all university colleges went on to this virtual teaching framework. And this has been a real challenge for students because, like bell hooks, I've always, and Jordan, you went to Eugene Lane College where all of our classes were in a seminar format where strategically the university said these classes would be small. Well, when I came to the University of South Florida, one of the things that, and I think this is not just at this university, but the way that a classroom is traditionally set up is the chairs are in rows. And so you have students sitting before a student behind a student. And I have now I've been teaching in the English department at USF now for over a decade. I've had the classrooms where I teach worked in a space where the chairs could be reconfigured from these traditional row settings into a circle setting. And it's been interesting because before we went into this virtual environment, my students would come in and, the first class session, and I would say, okay, look, this is not the way we're going to work this. These chairs are going to have to be moved into a circle formation. I actually insisted with the individuals who work for the English department and assign us room spaces to give me a room space that was big enough, because generally in my undergraduate classes, the count for the students would be something like 30. And so I would say, look, I need a room that would be big enough for me to reconfigure the room from these traditional rows into a framework where the students could sit in circles where everybody could see each other. Because I'm not a lecturer, and bell hooks has taught me this whole idea of the professor knowing everything is not the way to really teach education as a practice of freedom. What Jordan, from your experience with me, is that the classroom should be a laboratory dialogic space where, even though I'm quote unquote and you're the professor, we really work to engage a dialogic space of freedom where every student can see not only each other's face in that circle, but can begin to, based upon the self-reflective critical interpretation of text assigned, can begin to see the interior of the individual. I call it soul work. In fact, what was it, in 2019, I published another book, edited volume called, Hooked on the Art of Love, My Calling for Soul Work, Bell Hooks and My Calling for Soul Work, where I actually engaged not only people within the context of academia, students, professors, but also individuals outside the academic arena in building community partnerships so that we could actually get a sense of a clear connection with higher education as not just being in an academic traditional context, but higher education as being inclusive of all people, whether they're working on a college degree or they're in a working class environment where their jobs are not about degrees from that academic standpoint. So I just want to summarize and say this whole idea of the reconfiguration, literally, of the classroom as a space where there is this inclusive dialogical element that is represented in the ways that individuals can really be joined together in this community circle, but also from a self-reflective well-being environment where everyone feels that they are included. And so, as I said before, it was inspiring to me in this semester, even in this virtual context of having to deal with technology up and down, in and out. No one of the students in either class dropped the course. So there, Amanda, and you said, well, hey, Gary, that's such a small, little bitty thing of hope. And actually, for me, that's where hope begins.
No, I actually, in reading your book, that was the first point that I brought up to Jordan was that this is the common thread in our conversations about your work before it, because it's so symbolic about where this conversation begins and ends in this country, and how hard it is, in Jordan's book, to even bring up feminism in any of these environments among men without freaking everybody out. So I love that it's the I had no idea you were going to answer that way, and it's I think it's hugely symbolic of a willingness, a curiosity to at least listen, whereas before there would have just been like a no, thank you, goodbye.
Absolutely, Amanda. It starts right where we are. You say, well, there's only three of us. Actually, it's a spirit of what we've joined together to do. Mm-hmm. And Amanda, you said something that's critically important. Let's listen to each other. Hey, I never thought about that before. And so I have this clear sense of what Chinua Achebe calls empathetic imagination. Step into my shoes. Well, I don't like your shoes. I don't like the color of their shoes. And they're too big. They're too small. They're not stylish. Okay, well, still try. Okay, ooh, they hurt. Yeah, well, imagine where I am, and I will imagine the pain that you're going through as you try to step in the other's shoes. And so using that as a kind of metaphor of what it means to talk about the complexity of the ways that systemic and institutionalized oppression and domination separates us, when we begin to hear you write analytically and self-reflectively about your interpretation of the text that we're reading, you begin to say, oh, well, I didn't think about it like that. So now you've opened my eyes. And I have this continuously going on, not only this past semester. And I think, Jordan, the thing that has kept me in this long-standing struggle for social justice has been this key to the evidential power of self-reflection and critical awareness. If you listen, you may not like my story, but I think everybody has at some point shedded a tear about something that was traumatizing for that individual. Mm-hmm. And I don't have a problem shedding tears with my students. Because when I hear you tell me, even though you say, well, I'm not a BIPOC person, but I was traumatized because of the size of my body, or because, I was too this or not that, or I was smart and so on and so forth. Then I'm like, that's a connection that we need to make, because guess what? Every person in this room has experienced some type of trauma related to being on the outside. Mm-hmm. And I originally, and I don't know, Jordan, and I think I might say it in the book, Black Male Outsider, but I came up with that title because, as authors, we got to like, okay, so what's going to be the title of this book, this article, this chapter, and so we have to think about this. But one of the compelling writers over the course of my study in relationship to Bell Hooks's work has been Audre Lorde. And so her book, Sister Outsider, was so compelling to me that when I was contemplating the title of this book, I started to really go back over the course of my life and think about autobiographically being on the outside of what the normative idea of manhood and masculinity would be, that I was so drawn and compelled by the title of her book, Sister Outsider. I'm like, man, you need to work with that. And so that's where that Black Male Outsider, that's where that main title came from. Mm-hmm. And I will always remember her poetic giftedness. She has a poem called, she titles Litany for Survival. And it begins by the opening, we were never meant to survive, but we have. And we have to talk about how we can continue to survive. And so I think strategically, it's not to pull back from the complexity and the complicated dialogic frameworks that, we're trying to create in this open space where everybody feels included. But we have to go to those places where people feel like they have been othered for their difference. But I always say to my students, difference makes a difference when you express your difference.
So many things in my head. I before I get to the next thing I wanted to ask you, I just want to say that I also, when I teach, make all the students put the chairs into a circle, and then I make them leave it because I think of it as like a tiny subversive act. Or I hope the next person who has to use the classroom might not have time to put them back in order and therefore discover something. So sometimes I get a nasty email and then we have to put them back. But I always try to hope that I can infect two classes that way. The thing I wanted to bring up, something that really struck me reading Black Male Outsider, in the section where you talk about being a survivor of domestic abuse as a child, and then you talked about your partner telling you that your silence was violent, and this really struck me. And what I think you were talking about how when you would have a conflict or an argument that you would get silent, and it hadn't occurred to you that your silence was hurtful. This really struck me because and I'm sure Amanda can attest, in my own romantic relationships, I find that I do that we'll get into arguments and I just kind of disassociate, and I realized that from reading this, that, how do I say this?
I'm so glad you're discovering this right now. Thank you.
No, what I realized was that and I have so many stories of like romantic relationships throughout my life when someone would say, "Why aren't you saying anything?" Why? And I was just like, "Because I'm trying." I realized from reading this that although I do not have anything near the kind of domestic abuse stories that you describe, I grew up in there was yelling and certainly some toxic things, but no violence, no physical violence. But I realized that what I learned from that was to avoid that conflict, to be silent so that my father wouldn't keep yelling at me. But you learn to shut up because the next time you talk, it just escalates the conflict. And I realized from reading this that even with my own kids, I find myself sometimes angry, like trying to get them to the point where they'll be silent. And you really made, and I'm a little ashamed of that after reading it, because I do reproduce that. If you don't stop talking back, I'm going to take away all your electronics, right? This kind of thing. But that fear that talking back is really, we start to teach people to deal with conflict through silence, and this is not. Can you talk a bit about that idea and how you and what it meant to you and how it came up in the book?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting. This whole idea that this question really centers around is this the need to deconstruct heteronormative ideas of manhood and masculinity. And certainly Bell Hooks does that. And I was just immediately thinking about her book, Talking Back, Thinking Feminist, Thinking Black. Well, one of the things, and I've told this story so many times, and I'm still working through this because my wife, now we've been married for 38 years and all three of our children are grown. They have their own children. Is that now, and she's written a play called Now Is Not the Time for Silence. And I actually published an excerpt of her play in one of my books. But one of the things that I think the whole idea of this binary construction of identity in terms of gender is that to be male identified means that you have to shut down your vulnerability. Now we can, as quote unquote, those of us who identify in a male context can have emotions, but they got to be like, yeah, you mess with me and I'm going to, it has to be like this kind of like exterior kind of representation of a power of domination. But the reality is that men are human beings too. And how do we teach each other to be vulnerable? That's not a loss of your masculinity. Perhaps it's a gain of your humanity. And so I'm still working through that because I was reared. My father, military veteran, and part of, I think, the domestic violence that I experienced in the context of his relationship to my mother was the way that even in the context of his upbringing, my father left home when he was 13 years old and joined the military when he was 19. And I always wanted to ask him, what did you do during those years from age 13 to 19, living out on the streets? I know that must have been traumatizing for my father, particularly as a Black male, being homeless. And I think all of the ways that so often men, we internalize hurt and pain to the extent that the way we deal with it is to act it out in aggressive ways that hide who we are on the inside. And this, I tell my students, particularly those students who identify as male, whether it's from a cisgender standpoint or a transgender standpoint, you really have to talk about your feelings. And I have really devoted my whole teaching and pedagogical practice to a therapeutic agency of self-reflection. And of course, I didn't make this up. And you, Jordan, and Amanda, you've read Black Male Outsider. You know that my work is rooted in bell hooks' whole concept of self-actualization. That's a phrase, of course, that she uses. But one of the things that I think a pedagogy that really asserts itself for the liberation of the oppressed is to really center itself around self-reflection. Now, of course, as teachers, we've got to, we have to keep our jobs. It's like you got to teach the, analytical tools for interpretation, whatever discipline you're in. But I tell my students, yes, you are profoundly outstanding in your analytical perspective. But what does this have to do with you in your everyday living? And what I have done over the course of time is to really focus on this idea of the integration of bell hooks would say, the personal with the political. But I would say, adding to that, the personal with the political, with the professional as the core of the pedagogical. And so I tell my students, professionally, you're getting your degree and, you have this high grade point average. But what are you going to take in the profession of yourself, in your goals for what you want to do in your life calling in terms of your discipline? So you said, I've got to put myself on the line in terms of my goals for my education. Why not? Why not think about your disciplinary specialization in relationship to how you can enable someone who doesn't have the professional credentials that you're obtaining to believe that they can be as powerful as you, even though they may never arrive at that place of your professional location. But again, I think it's, for me, this whole idea of being a man means opening yourself up to being a human individual. And that is about release.
Well, we're getting we're running out of time, so I want to give you an opportunity. Do you have do you have any questions you want to ask me or Amanda or both of us?
Well, just in terms of your agency, the two of you in the project that you're working on, in terms of now, obviously, with the father figure and, working to be this pro-feminist identified model of what can enable males to be representative models of support for women. How, Amanda, what is your sense of Jordan's journey toward the publication of this book?
Well, I'm first of all, I appreciate the question, and we've been together for 10 years, and because of Jordan's academic path and my profession in feminism, he's always been an extraordinary articulator of even what's has not been apparent to me, patterns, unconscious patterns, etc., around feminism. And the way that's manifested, one example I've given multiple times, but I love to talk about, is we didn't live together for 10 years. And in large part, that was because Jordan said, I don't want to unconsciously reproduce anything that would have you become my property in any way. We defined our relationship very early on as I set you free. And we even jokingly look at each other regularly and go, you don't own me, you don't control me, you can't tell me what to do. And it's, and that's I think one of the things I love about our relationship is I've never felt freer as a person than I do in relationship with Jordan. And so everyone's human, of course. So there's clearly moments of unconscious where I'm like, dude, you're doing that thing that you wrote about in your book that you had to mention to do, and you're doing it. You know, I use that one often, but especially when I'm trying to win an argument. But overall, when I got divorced, I swore off relationships because I didn't know that one could like this one could even exist. And I'm really grateful that it does.
Well, you know, I appreciate, Amanda, your being so open and honest, because one of the things my wife says, and I have to really go back and like, okay, so you've written all these books, but are you really acting on what you say? And I'm like, oh, oops. So, but you know, I have to really, I struggle, Jordan, against this idea of appropriation. Like, oh yeah, it's in to be a pro-feminist, womanist, identified man. I'm like, wait, but are we really doing this because this promotes our academic scholarship and so on? Or are we activist oriented, where we can stand up outside of academia for women's rights? And so I think it's a test. And I'm like, I understand this idea of appropriation, but I'm not perfect. And as Amanda said, you know, who is? We're all working through. But again, I think, Jordan, I would want to say that our meeting today is simply the journey of our work together in partnership for what vision we have been given to do in this life. And that is to stand up for the oppressed, especially in the context of gender oppression. So your inspiration for the book.
What is
I was saying for Jordan to consider.
What is my inspiration for the book? Oof. It's a hard, there's so many, it's a hard question. In some ways, I think you said it very well, that I wanted to, it became very clear to me in the last few years as we've seen a sort of, I like to think of it as the sort of final swing of or hopefully think of it as the final swing of patriarchal masculinity, right? The sort of as we're starting to call things out, stand up for one more punch and fight as hard as you can. But it became very clear to me as I would watch the news, as I would see all the things happening, not just in the U.S., all over the world, it is that while we are doing a very good job, I think, of starting to have serious dialogues about oppression and exploitation. And, you can barely get through a one episode of any show on the news, well, almost any show on the news, without it coming up, without people talking about intersectionality, without, all these things are becoming so common in the mainstream dialogue. But it struck me that when I would talk to so many men that I knew, that there was no image for what it looked like to have both. I don't want to say to have manhood, because that's so loaded, but what does it even mean to identify as a man without also identifying as a misogynist, right? Whether you mean that no one's conscious, well, some people might consciously do it, but very few are standing up going, I want to be sexist, right? But there's no image of what that looks like. So the real reason that I wrote this book, and tried to write it in a way that was very non-judgmental of men, because it was a book about saying, I think you want to make different decisions. You're all saying you want to make different decisions, but without role models, without a fatherhood role model that's offering a different image, there's nothing to aspire to. There's no icon out there to aspire to. And as much as we all want to be unique, we also use the different images around the world and around the media as aspirational. And so I wanted to offer an image. But what's interesting and what's great about this conversation that we're having right now is that the way I did it, the way I tried to do it, and the way I think I succeeded in doing it is that I didn't offer a static image of what I thought what it meant to be a pro-feminist man or a feminist dad or whatever language you want to use. Instead, I tried to offer an image of what it looked like to be willing to engage in the kind of self-interrogation that leads to critical consciousness.
The self-interrogation that leads to critical consciousness. That's the sum of it.
Yeah.
And I think the task that we, as men who are progressive and insightful about the way that systemic and institutionalized oppression has worked and continues to be perpetuated, we have to be the model.
Yeah.
And so it means standing out. It means being the other. And so that's what I take this experience of your writing this book and your relationship to Amanda and to your children as a model of what it means to be for the rights of all. The oppressed means that you are standing out. And yeah, there's a price you pay. But ultimately, it's about sacrifice. How much you're willing to sacrifice for some others to live who have no idea of what life, the joy of life for justice is all about. So this has been, and of course, now, Amanda, for me, I'm like, okay, so this was one dialogue. And so, I'm continuing to work on, I've got a couple of book projects I'm working on and so on and so forth. So I probably will be saying, look, I need the two of you to be thinking about contributing to this edited volume.
Well, it was profound when I read your book because, knowing how deeply rooted you are in Jordan's consciousness. And I was like, my God, now I know where all of this stuff started for you. And so I really do hope this is the beginning and not the end, because we don't know many folk like you. And we want to know more because we live in our own little bubble and everyone else looks at us like we have three heads. So I'm so grateful to be here with you and to be able to take this discourse even further in whatever context that is.
Well, Amanda, let's make the bubble bigger because we've laid the groundwork for exploding the smallness of it to make it enlarged where it becomes a global bubble.
That's our whole life's work. And I don't feel it is appropriating at all. In fact, I'm freaking tired. So the more you guys can take this on, please, dear God.
I hear you. Yeah, because one of us can't do it by ourselves. We can be models, but we need support for hope. And this has given me yet another level of saying, you need to keep doing what you're doing. Yeah. Because here, after a decade, I'm reaching out to you. And guess what? I've written a book and I'm sending it to you. And then I need to have a dialogue with you. And so for me, I leave this conversation believing that this is the beginning of a series of dialogues.
Amazing.
Verbally and written. So when I send you the proposal to you and Amanda, you all simply have to say yes. And then
Okay, done.
Yes.
Now I may not have a ring, but bell rings. And so,